The Gilded Age was built on power, on wealth, and on last names that ruled America. But behind the grand balls and glittering palaces, behind the diamonds and the champagne, were secrets no one was supposed to know. Forbidden romances, dangerous affairs, scandals whispered behind closed doors. And in an age where reputation was power, love could be the most dangerous game of all. One letter in the wrong hands, one affair exposed, one name dragged through the papers. Buyer could destroy an empire overnight. Today, we reveal the hidden romances and explosive scandals that turned America's richest families into front-page disasters, and the love stories that cost them everything. This is the Gilded Age as you've never seen it before, where hearts broke, reputations burned, and fortunes vanished. The Gilded Age has been widely remembered as a period of extravagant mansions, industrial empires, and fortunes so vast they defied comprehension. But behind the marble facades and diamond-studded soirees was another history entirely, a history built on transactional love, international marriages, and scandalous unions that destabilized some of the era's greatest fortunes. Across the final decades of the 19th century, more than 500 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic, carrying fortunes that European aristocrats desperately needed. Their marriages were celebrated as glamorous alliances between old-world nobility and new-world capital. Yet the private realities of these unions reveal something darker: coercion, manipulation, psychological warfare, and the systematic extraction of American wealth in exchange for foreign titles. This investigation explores the most destructive of these alliances, the marriages that resulted not in prestige, but in the collapse of personal fortunes, reputations, and lives. These cases show how the collision between American money and European aristocracy produced consequences far more devastating than society acknowledged at the time. The late 19th century produced fortunes so vast they reshaped nations, industries, and the entire global social order. Yet behind the shimmering facade of marble mansions, railway empires, and diamond-studded debutante balls lay a parallel history, one defined not by prosperity, but by ruin. The great irony of the Gilded Age was that the very wealth intended to secure dynastic stability often became the catalyst for destruction when combined with the era's most seductive currency, marriage. This investigation examines how love, or what passed for it, became one of the most effective mechanisms for transferring, dissolving, or catastrophically depleting the fortunes that built modern America. Throughout the Gilded Age, more than 500 American heiresses crossed the Atlantic bearing fortunes that European aristocrats desperately needed to preserve decaying estates. These unions were celebrated as glamorous fusions of American capital and European pedigree, but the public narrative concealed an uncomfortable truth. Behind many of these marriages were coercion, fraud, emotional manipulation, and carefully orchestrated schemes that used romance as a facade for financial extraction. The stories that follow reveal how the intersection of class ambition, naive idealism, and raw economic desperation produced some of the most extraordinary personal collapses of the era. The structure of these scandals followed a surprisingly consistent pattern. Heiresses were raised in controlled environments designed to cultivate refinement, obedience, and social grace qualities considered essential for entry into elite circles. European suitors, typically facing crushing debts and vanishing revenues, understood perfectly how to position themselves as glamorous saviors, offering access to ancient lineages and aristocratic identity. American families, eager to legitimize fortunes earned through aggressive business practices, welcomed these nobles into their parlors with a mixture of awe and strategic calculation. Every participant in this system played a predetermined role, yet the consequences were anything but predictable. The wealth that powered these marriages was unprecedented. By 1890, the top 1% of Americans controlled more than half of the nation's assets. Railroad empires, mining monopolies, and speculative finance generated fortunes so immense that single families could fund entire municipal budgets. This concentration of capital made heiresses irresistible targets for suitors whose economic survival depended on finding partners with vast liquid resources. The marriages, framed publicly as romantic triumphs, often functioned as complex financial transactions, with terms understood more clearly by the groom's family than by the bride herself. One of the defining features of these unions was asymmetrical transparency. American families displayed their wealth openly through lavish weddings, newspaper announcements, and legal documentation. European families, in contrast, concealed their financial precarity behind the armor of noble lineage. Estates that looked magnificent on postcards were frequently entangled in mortgages, arrears, and generational mismanagement. Titles carried prestige, but not solvency. Heiresses entered marriages believing they were acquiring status. In reality, they were inheriting debt. The social machinery of the era ensured that women bore the heaviest consequences of these mismatched alliances. Divorce, though legally possible, was socially catastrophic. Separation without legal dissolution trapped women financially and emotionally. Annulments required humiliating testimony that often became fodder for the international press. Many heiresses remained in disastrous marriages for decades, sacrificing health, fortune, and dignity to maintain appearances demanded by families and society. The pattern becomes clearer when examining the early alliances that set the template. Families from New York, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Cincinnati pushed their daughters onto the international stage with the expectation that foreign titles would elevate American status. Even the wealthiest mothers harbored insecurities about their position within elite social circles. A European marriage offered instant legitimacy, validating fortunes built through speculation, labor exploitation, or corporate ruthlessness. The ideological exchange money for pedigree was a uniquely Gilded Age phenomenon in which romance served as a thin veneer over transactional objectives. These marriages also reflected structural gender inequalities embedded within both American and European legal systems. Under the laws governing many European estates, husbands automatically controlled their wives' assets once transferred as dowry or settlement. Even when trusts attempted to safeguard inheritances, loopholes, coercion, and the sheer force of social expectation enabled husbands to circumvent protective measures. Women were not merely companions but vehicles through which wealth could be mobilized. Archival court records, estate papers, and personal correspondence reveal the emotional toll hidden behind polite society's rigid facade. Heiresses described feelings of entrapment, isolation, and betrayal that contradicted public perceptions of privilege. Many entered marriage believing in the idealized notion of romantic partnership, only to discover that their husbands viewed them primarily as financial resources. The lack of legal autonomy compounded their vulnerability, making it nearly impossible to escape destructive unions without enduring public scandal. A defining aspect of these marriages was the role of the media. Newspapers and society columns glamorized engagements, celebrated elaborate European ceremonies, and enthusiastically reported on the social ascension of American families. Yet the same press that exalted these unions also amplified their failures. Divorce proceedings became international spectacles. Intimate details, financial disclosures, and personal accusations filled headlines. The collapse of a fortune-hunting marriage was not merely a private tragedy but a public entertainment consumed across continents. This documentary analysis begins by examining the systemic conditions that created the transatlantic marriage market. The Industrial Revolution had produced unprecedented American wealth, concentrated within a small class of families whose influence extended from Wall Street to Washington. These fortunes attracted European nobles who lacked the economic means to maintain ancestral properties but possessed titles that conferred instant social prestige. The convergence of these interests created a marriage economy that bridged two worlds, yet served neither fairly. The social environment of the Gilded Age reinforced the expectation that women served as instruments of family strategy. Heiresses were trained from childhood to navigate elite social rituals, but few were prepared for the complexities of international marriages shaped by financial desperation. American mothers often played the role of negotiators, weighing the benefits of titles against the risks of foreign entanglements. Fathers, accustomed to the brutal logic of industrial capitalism, sometimes underestimated the depth of financial instability facing European estates. The miscalculations that followed became the foundation of scandals whose repercussions stretched across decades. The increasing frequency of these unions created competition among European nobles for the wealthiest American brides. Letters, memoirs, and diplomatic reports document a nearly industrialized form of courtship in which nobles attended American social functions specifically to identify wealthy targets. Some cultivated American patrons to gain introductions. Others falsely inflated their status or concealed debts. The boundary between romance and opportunism became increasingly indistinct. This era also saw the rise of professional matchmakers, who specialized in facilitating transatlantic unions. Their networks spanned London, Paris, Newport, and Fifth Avenue. For a fee, they arranged introductions, negotiated settlements, and managed public relations. The high success rate of these intermediaries contributed to an illusion of compatibility that dissolved once marriages entered their operational phase. Their work demonstrates how marriage, in this context, functioned as a commercial enterprise rather than an emotional partnership. What distinguishes the scandals explored in this study is not merely the loss of wealth, but the scale of human consequence. Some heiresses were ruined financially, others suffered emotional collapse, a few died as direct or indirect results of their marriages. These outcomes underscore the structural vulnerability of women whose economic power paradoxically increased their exposure to exploitation. This investigation also addresses the long-term impacts on family legacies. Many of the fortunes lost through these marriages took generations to accumulate, but only years to dissipate. Estates that might have shaped American philanthropy, urban development, or cultural institutions instead evaporated into European debts, failed investments, and personal extravagance. The disappearance of these fortunes altered the trajectory of American elite families, reducing their ability to influence national policy, business, and society. At the same time, these scandals catalyzed important legal reforms. High-profile annulments and divorce cases raised questions about women's economic rights, the validity of marriage settlements, and the ethics of transatlantic alliances. Though change came slowly, the visibility of these scandals contributed to broader conversations about gender, autonomy, and financial exploitation that shaped early 20th century legal reforms. In analyzing these cases, this documentary seeks to move beyond sensationalist narratives and examine the structural forces that enabled such widespread financial and emotional devastation. Each scandal represents not only a personal tragedy, but also a failure of the systems designed to protect women and regulate wealth. The patterns that emerge reveal the inherent instability of marriages constructed as economic exchanges rather than balanced partnerships. This series will explore the underlying mechanisms of these collapses, the individuals who orchestrated them, and the broader social environment that allowed such destructive unions to flourish. By situating each scandal within its historical context, we illuminate the dynamics of power, vulnerability, and ambition that defined the Gilded Age and shaped the lives of the women who became unwilling participants in one of the most complex marriage markets in history. The evolution of the transatlantic marriage market was not merely a social curiosity but a structural response to global economic pressures. For European aristocracies, the late 19th century marked a period of acute financial contraction. Agricultural revenues collapsed under the impact of industrial competition, global grain imports, and declining rural populations. Estates that once generated consistent income now drained what little capital remained. For many noble families, the only viable solution lay in securing American wealth through marriage. American fortunes, however, were not simply pools of capital. They represented the triumph of an economic system characterized by aggressive expansion, rapid industrialization, and minimal regulation. Newly wealthy industrialists sought the one asset money could not easily purchase within the United States: social legitimacy. Marrying into European aristocracy offered a form of symbolic purification, laundering fortunes built on railroads, oil, coal, and finance through the perceived moral prestige of ancient titles. This reciprocal need created a unique socio-political environment where marriage became an instrument of international economic stabilization. Historians often refer to these unions as domestic foreign investments, transactions in which American families sought symbolic returns, while European families sought financial liquidity. Though framed as romance in newspapers, these alliances operated under the same principles that governed corporate mergers and strategic acquisitions. The earliest wave of scandal emerged when the underlying instability of these arrangements became evident. American families underestimated the severity of European financial crises, while European nobles misjudged the rigidity of American wealth protections. Conflict arose when the expectations each side brought into marriage proved incompatible with the realities they faced. Women in particular experienced the full weight of these contradictions. They were expected to embody refinement, loyalty, and grace, while simultaneously providing the finances necessary to sustain estates they had never seen. Their role within the marriage was both symbolic and practical. They were presented as the link between two worlds, Yet neither world fully acknowledged their autonomy. The dissolution of early transatlantic marriages served as a warning, but the momentum of the marriage market continued unabated. Families were invested in maintaining the illusion of success. Matchmakers, journalists, and social leaders promoted these unions as the pinnacle of modern civilization, glossing over the increasing number of cases in which marriages devolved into financial ruin or emotional collapse. The central issue was the profound asymmetry between the legal structures governing American wealth and European marriage. In many European jurisdictions, dowries became the husband's property upon marriage. Trust protections were circumvented through aggressive legal maneuvering, emotional coercion, or strategic manipulation. Women who attempted to intervene in the management of their own fortunes often faced accusations of impropriety, disrespect, or hysterical behavior charges that carried significant social penalties. The consequences of this structural imbalance are best illustrated by examining the financial dimensions of these unions. Some marriages involved annual allowances that equaled the budgets of small cities. Others transferred securities, real estate, or stocks that altered the balance sheets of entire families. The sums involved were staggering. Single marriage settlements sometimes exceeded the capital investments of major industrial projects. The speed with which fortunes disappeared was equally remarkable. In several notable cases, fortunes built over decades through intense labor, risk, and innovation evaporated within a few years of marriage. These losses were not always the result of overt malice. Often they stemmed from fundamental incompatibilities in financial philosophy. American capitalists favored investment, accumulation, and controlled risk. European aristocrats favored preservation of lifestyle, maintenance of tradition, and external displays of status. When these divergent systems collided within marriage, the results were often catastrophic. Public perception played a critical role in shaping the trajectory of these scandals. Society papers celebrated engagements with elaborate descriptions of gowns, jewels, titles, and family histories. Newspaper editors understood that the public craved tales of wealth, romance, and social ascent. Yet the same papers quickly pivoted to sensationalist coverage when marriages collapsed. Divorce filings, annulment trials, and inheritance disputes filled columns with details that would have been unthinkable for earlier generations. This paradox placed heiresses in an impossible position. The public demanded elaborate displays of wealth and status, yet punished the same women harshly when those marriages failed. Their misfortunes were scrutinized, debated, and judged by individuals with little understanding of the pressures they faced. The legal consequences of these scandals rippled across continents. High-profile annulments forced courts to confront uncomfortable questions regarding marital rights, financial exploitation, and personal autonomy. These cases illuminated the extent to which marriage served as a mechanism of wealth transfer rather than as an institution of mutual partnership. By the early 20th century, some American families began to resist the transatlantic marriage market altogether. They recognized the pattern of financial depletion and emotional devastation and sought to protect their daughters from becoming targets of European opportunists. Trust structures became more sophisticated. Marriage settlements incorporated clauses designed to prevent unilateral transfer of wealth. Legal reforms gradually expanded women's property rights, reducing their financial vulnerability. Nevertheless, the entrenched cultural narrative surrounding marriage persisted. Heiresses continued to face pressure to elevate family status through advantageous unions, even as evidence of the dangers mounted. The mythos of the dollar princess, a woman whose fortune could rescue a noble house and secure her a title, retained its allure long after the reality proved otherwise. To understand how deeply these dynamics affected individual lives, one must examine the intimate correspondence that survived. Letters written by heiresses reveal feelings of suffocation, disappointment, and helplessness. They describe marriages in which affection was secondary to necessity, where partners viewed each other through the lens of benefit rather than connection. The emotional dissonance between public celebration and private suffering created psychological conditions that many women endured in silence. Financial documents complement these personal accounts. Bank records, debt ledgers, and estate inventories expose the speed and scale of monetary erosion. In some cases, fortunes declined through steady overspending. In others, through speculative ventures undertaken without spousal consent. The erosion of wealth often mirrored the erosion of trust within marriages. The international nature of these alliances complicates the narrative further. Financial institutions across London, New York, Paris, and Edinburgh participated in structuring marriage settlements. Diplomats mediated disputes. Lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic navigated contradictory legal frameworks. The marriage market was not merely a social phenomenon, it was an international economic enterprise. This documentary approach situates love scandals within this larger matrix of power, money, and law. Each marriage represents a microcosm of broader historical forces, revealing how individual lives were shaped by systems much larger than themselves. To begin exploring these cases, one must first acknowledge that the concept of romantic love as the foundation of marriage was still evolving during the Gilded Age. Many marriages, especially among elite families, served strategic purposes. Emotional compatibility was often secondary to financial or social objectives. This context explains why many of the heiresses entered unions with men whose values, expectations, and lifestyles differed dramatically from their own. The contrast between American and European definitions of marriage became a persistent source of conflict. Americans generally viewed marriage as a partnership with potential for mutual growth. Europeans viewed marriage as a continuation of lineage and tradition. These divergent frameworks shaped how each spouse approached finances, communication, and daily life. When compounded by pressures of public expectation and private disappointment, even minor disagreements became amplified into significant crises. Despite the immense resources available to them, heiresses often lacked meaningful support networks. Their families prioritized reputation over well-being, discouraging them from expressing dissatisfaction. Courts offered limited recourse. Social norms punished women who pursued separation. These constraints contributed to the prolonged suffering evident in many of the scandals explored in this work. The historical significance of these marriages extends beyond the personal tragedies they produced. They reveal the fragility of even the greatest fortunes when subjected to the pressures of incompatible values and unequal power. They demonstrate how financial systems, whether familial, national, or international, can fail individuals when designed without regard for autonomy or fairness. They illuminate the gendered dimensions of wealth, showing how women's economic contributions were simultaneously essential and unprotected. The following case examinations build upon this foundation, tracing the exact mechanisms through which fortunes collapsed. Through detailed analysis of court testimonies, estate records, newspaper archives, and personal correspondence, the documentary reconstructs the chain of events that transformed marriages from celebrated social achievements into catastrophic financial disasters. This analytical framework allows for a deeper understanding of why these scandals occurred, how they unfolded, and what their legacies reveal about the Gilded Age as a whole. It moves beyond sensationalism to examine the intersection of structural inequality, cultural expectation, and human vulnerability that defined the era. The remainder of this series continues by examining the most consequential cases in chronological detail, demonstrating how patterns of ambition, desire, and desperation converged to produce outcomes that reshaped families, destroyed fortunes, and ultimately exposed the dark undercurrent beneath the glittering surface of America's most iconic age of wealth. The first major scandal to crystallize public awareness of the dangers embedded in transatlantic marriage was the union between Alice Cornelia Thaw and the Earl of Yarmouth. The case became a template for understanding how wealth, title, and desperation converged to produce outcomes that defied even the expectations of the era's most cynical observers. By examining the structural forces behind the marriage, rather than merely recounting its dramatic collapse, it becomes possible to see why this particular scandal left such an enduring mark on public consciousness. Alice, daughter of the formidable Mary Copley Thaw and railroad titan William Thaw, entered adulthood with an inheritance that placed her among the wealthiest young women in America. Her assets were vast, diversified, and carefully managed, yet the same financial security that shielded her from economic danger magnified her vulnerability in the international marriage market. Wealth signaled opportunity for those seeking financial rescue, and few aristocrats embodied desperation as starkly as George Francis Alexander Seymour, the heir to the Marquisate of Hertford. At the time of their meeting, Seymour was already navigating the ruins of his own financial life. He had cultivated an image of aristocratic grace and hereditary privilege, but the facade concealed years of unpaid debts, bankruptcy filings, and failed ventures. His most striking trait was his ability to reinvent himself, whether performing on stage under theatrical pseudonyms, recasting his mismanagement as generosity, or presenting temporary liquidity as enduring solvency. His charm was not merely social but strategic, tailored to appeal to American families unfamiliar with the intricacies of British aristocratic collapse. The engagement between Alice and Seymour progressed with a speed that later raised questions among family members, legal advisors, and journalists. The compressed timeline served an obvious strategic purpose: to finalize the marriage before the full extent of the Earl's financial ruin became public knowledge. The social machinery of Washington and New York lent legitimacy to the match, obscuring underlying concerns. Society papers focused on the spectacle, the gowns, the gifts, the guest lists, while ignoring the absence of meaningful due diligence. The decisive moment occurred on the wedding day, when Seymour refused to proceed with the ceremony unless Alice's mother transferred securities valued at approximately $1 million directly to him. This ultimatum, issued in a crowded church and delivered under the pressure of thousands of awaiting spectators, was more than an act of coercion. It was a calculated exploitation of social expectation. Mary Thaw faced a choice between immediate public scandal or capitulation. To avert humiliation, she authorized the transfer, an unprecedented single-day movement of wealth, to a private individual under conditions that resembled extortion more than marriage negotiation. The aftermath of the wedding revealed the depth of incompatibility between the public image of the union and its private reality. Seymour's expectations of unfettered financial access clashed with the structure of Alice's trusts. His efforts to convert her assets into a personal operating fund were met with legal resistance. Social pressures compounded the tension. The veneer of noble legitimacy crumbled as reports of his theatrical past and questionable associations circulated through British society. Within years, the marriage deteriorated completely, culminating in a high-profile annulment based on medical testimony regarding Seymour's incapacity. Alice's experience illustrates the structural vulnerability built into transatlantic unions. Despite her family's wealth, influence, and intelligence, she remained susceptible to a system in which titles carried more social weight than due diligence. The financial and emotional consequences she endured served as a warning not only to her contemporaries, but to future generations navigating similar cross-cultural alliances. Her ordeal exposed the mechanisms through which personal fortunes could be jeopardized by strategic marriages that prioritized appearance over compatibility. Another scandal that defined the era's marriage economy was the union between Helena Zimmerman and the Duke of Manchester. Unlike the rapid implosion of the Thaw-Yarmouth marriage, Helena's ordeal unfolded over 3 decades, demonstrating how destructive patterns could persist when embedded within legal structures that favored husbands and restricted women's ability to protect their assets. Helena entered the marriage with substantial financial protections. Her father, Eugene Zimmerman, structured her inheritance through rigid trusts designed to prevent dissipation. Yet even the most sophisticated legal frameworks proved vulnerable when confronted with sustained pressure from a husband determined to access funds. The Duke of Manchester, like many of his contemporaries, inherited a title accompanied by crushing financial obligations. His estate was symbolic of aristocratic decline, a magnificent facade concealing structural decay. From the outset, the Duke demonstrated a pattern of aggressive spending detached from economic reality. Early scandals, such as his purchase of imitation pearl necklaces without payment, hinted at a deeper issue: chronic financial mismanagement. His expenditures escalated dramatically once married, encompassing lavish hospitality, estate improvements, speculative ventures, and personal indulgences. Although trust protections prevented direct access to the principal, the Duke exploited every available avenue to extract liquidity from Helena's resources. The marriage became a prolonged case study in the consequences of structural inequality. Helena's legal rights were constrained by marriage laws that favored husband's authority. Emotional pressures further complicated her position. Divorce carried immense social stigma, and separation risked destabilizing the lives of her children. Her sense of duty, combined with the era's expectations of marital endurance, trapped her within a relationship that steadily eroded her financial security and emotional well-being. The Duke's eventual bankruptcy and criminal conviction for false pretenses revealed the full extent of his financial instability. His actions were not isolated lapses, but part of a sustained pattern that placed Helena at risk. By the time of their divorce in 1931, much of her fortune had been depleted, not through a single catastrophic event, but through decades of relentless extraction. Helena's eventual remarriage to the Honorable Earl of Kintore highlighted the contrast between exploitative unions and those based on mutual respect, but it also underscored the long-term damage inflicted by her first marriage. If the Thaw and Zimmermann scandals revealed the vulnerabilities of American heiresses, the marriage of Anna Gould to Count Boney de Castellane demonstrated the astronomical scale of destruction possible when wealth met aristocratic ambition unrestrained by practical boundaries. Anna, inheritor of one of the most formidable fortunes of the era, entered marriage with the desire to integrate into European society. Boney entered marriage with the desire to rebuild a family legacy through aesthetic achievement and public display. The construction of the Palais Rose became the defining symbol of their union. Conceived as a tribute to French royal architecture, the palace embodied the Count's philosophy of status, that grandeur, performance, and spectacle could restore a lineage whose material foundation had long since eroded. The palace's cost exceeded all reasonable metrics, consuming enormous portions of Anna's inheritance. Its maintenance alone required resources equivalent to the budgets of smaller European principalities. Boney's expenditures extended beyond architecture to encompass art collections, social events, residences, and travel. His lifestyle reflected an aristocratic worldview in which wealth existed to sustain outward expressions of refinement. Yet, the fundamental flaw in this worldview was that it assumed inexhaustibility, an assumption incompatible with Anna's finite inheritance. The cultural dimension of their marriage further complicated matters. Anna's American pragmatism conflicted with Boney's French aristocratic sensibilities. His relationships, both personal and social, operated under norms fundamentally different from those she understood. The combination of incompatible values, unequal power, and divergent expectations led to mounting tensions that culminated in divorce proceedings revealing the magnitude of financial loss. The dissolution of the Castellane-Gould marriage produced consequences that extended far beyond finances. The Palais Rose, once a symbol of aristocratic aspiration, became a monument to the unsustainability of transatlantic wealth transfer. Its eventual demolition served as a metaphor for the impermanence of status built on unstable economic foundations. Anna's remarriage into Boney's own aristocratic circle illustrated a reclaiming of agency, yet it could not undo the vast expenditures that had reshaped her fortune. Finally, the case of Mary Leiter and George Curzon emphasized that financial ruin was not the only risk associated with Gilded Age scandals. Curzon's political ambitions, supported materially and socially by Mary's wealth, brought the couple to the apex of imperial power. Yet the physical and emotional demands of Mary's role as vicereine of India, combined with Curzon's disregard for her well-being, led to her premature death. Her fortune enabled Curzon's success, but the personal cost was irreversible. Mary's experience highlights a broader truth, that the value extracted from women in these marriages extended beyond finances. Emotional labor, physical endurance, and social performance all contributed to the success of their husbands, yet these contributions remained unacknowledged. Mary's death at 36 symbolized the ultimate price exacted by a system that prioritized political ambition over human life. Each of these scandals, distinct in their details, shares a common structure. They reveal marriages in which wealth served as both asset and vulnerability, in which titles masked instability, and in which women bore disproportionate burdens. The collapse of fortunes was not solely the result of individual failings, but of the structural inequalities embedded within marriage itself. The analysis now turns toward the broader social repercussions these scandals generated. They reshaped legal norms, influenced public perceptions of aristocracy, and catalyzed debates regarding women's rights and financial autonomy. Their impact extended far beyond the individuals involved, altering the cultural landscape of the early 20th century. The consequences of Gilded Age marriage scandals extended far beyond the private experiences of the heiresses involved. Their stories became catalysts for shifting cultural attitudes toward inherited wealth, aristocratic authority, and the rights of women navigating systems designed to limit their autonomy. As these high-profile unions collapsed, they revealed structural vulnerabilities, not only in individual marriages, but also in the social institutions that supported them. The fallout produced measurable changes in public sentiment, legal reforms, and the evolving relationship between American fortunes and European titles. One of the most significant effects was the erosion of aristocratic prestige in the American imagination. For decades, the notion of marrying into the European nobility had held enormous allure. Titles symbolized continuity, heritage, and cultural legitimacy. Industrial fortunes, by contrast, were new, uncertain, and often socially stigmatized. But as cases like Thaw, Zimmerman, and Gould entered public discourse, Americans began to question the actual value of noble associations. The revelation that prestigious families were financially unstable, morally compromised, or administratively incompetent undermined the perceived superiority of aristocratic lineage. Newspaper editorials, once celebratory, adopted a more critical tone. Commentators observed that titles without financial foundation were little more than decorative traditions, no longer suited to modern realities. Society pages, which had previously glorified transatlantic engagements, began publishing cautionary articles questioning the wisdom of merging fortunes with families facing multi-generational decline. This shift did not occur instantaneously but gradually, as repeated scandals exposed a pattern too consistent to ignore. Simultaneously, a transformation occurred in how Americans perceived their own wealth. The expansion of philanthropic institutions, private foundations, and public civic projects provided new avenues through which industrial fortunes could cultivate legitimacy without reliance on foreign titles. Figures like Carnegie and Rockefeller promoted the concept of using wealth to shape society directly, rather than seeking validation through marriage. Although these developments did not eliminate interest in aristocratic unions, they diluted the social imperative that had once driven them. Legal reforms further accelerated this change. As heiresses faced catastrophic financial losses through marriage, families and advisors began strengthening trust structures to prevent unilateral access to principal funds. Marriage settlements were revised to include enforceable protections, such as prohibitions on liquidation without mutual consent, limits on spousal allowances, and mechanisms for reinstating funds in the event of separation. Financial guardians, lawyers, trustees, and family-appointed overseers gained increased authority, reducing the ability of opportunistic spouses to circumvent safeguards. These legal innovations were not solely reactive. They reflected the maturation of American financial systems and the increasing recognition that wealth required strategic management to preserve its longevity. The scandals highlighted the fact that emotional vulnerability could override financial logic, prompting families to adopt more formalized and less trust-based approaches to marriage negotiations. Beyond legal reforms, the scandals influenced early 20th century discourse surrounding women's rights. The public spectacle of heiresses testifying in court, asserting their financial autonomy, or challenging their husband's authority, contributed to a broader conversation about gender inequality. Newspapers chronicled not only the financial details of these cases, but also the emotional and psychological dynamics that led women to seek dissolution. Readers encountered stories of coercion, neglect, and entitlement that challenged idealized narratives of marital harmony. While the era's feminist movements focused primarily on suffrage, the marriage scandals underscored the economic dimensions of gender inequality. They revealed the limitations of property rights, the vulnerability of women with substantial wealth, and the absence of legal mechanisms to address emotional abuse or coercive financial control. Some commentators argued that these cases demonstrated the need for expanded legal protections for married women, including control over personal income, inheritance rights, and access to independent legal counsel. The cultural impact extended into the realm of literature and entertainment. Gilded Age marriage scandals became source material for novels, plays, and serialized newspaper fiction. Authors like Edith Wharton incorporated the dynamics of transatlantic unions into their work, revealing the emotional and psychological complexities behind marriages driven by status and economic calculation. These fictional portrayals, though dramatized, reflected public awareness of the dangers associated with strategic alliances, blending social critique with narrative intrigue. Art and photography also shaped public perception. Portraits of heiresses in opulent gowns juxtaposed with reports of their suffering created a visual narrative of contrast, wealth and vulnerability, privilege and entrapment. These images, widely circulated through magazines and illustrated papers, contributed to a new understanding of the heiress not as a purely enviable figure, but as someone navigating immense social pressure under restrictive conditions. The impact of these scandals was particularly evident in the shifting attitudes of younger generations. By the 1910 seconds, many American families grew skeptical of European suitors whose titles masked financial instability. Mothers who once aspired to secure noble matches for their daughters became more cautious, emphasizing character, compatibility, and shared values over social ambition. The number of transatlantic marriages declined as awareness spread. Meanwhile, European families increasingly recognized that American wealth came with stronger legal protections and greater scrutiny, reducing opportunities for exploitation. Despite these shifts, the marriage market did not disappear entirely. Some unions continued to thrive, particularly those based on genuine compatibility rather than economic necessity. Yet even successful marriages could not fully escape the shadow of the scandals that had preceded them. Public skepticism lingered, and elite families scrutinized suitors more carefully, utilizing financial investigators, legal advisors, and informal networks to evaluate marital prospects. The era of blindly romanticizing European titles had ended. As the narrative moves deeper into the structural consequences of these scandals, it becomes evident that the Gilded Age marriage market represented more than a social trend. It was a complex economic system embedded within global shifts in wealth, power, and tradition. Its failures exposed the fault lines beneath that system and accelerated the decline of aristocratic authority while strengthening the foundations of American financial culture. The analysis now turns to how these scandals shaped the futures of the families involved, revealing long-term consequences that extended across generations. Some families regained stability through strategic reinvestment, philanthropic leadership, or restructured financial portfolios. Others saw their fortunes permanently diminished, altering their social standing and influence. The ripple effects provide insight into how personal relationships can exert disproportionate influence on economic trajectories, shaping not only individual destinies but the broader evolution of elite society. The subsequent cases in this documentary deepen this understanding, by examining marriages that resulted not merely in financial ruin, but also in profound social displacement, emotional devastation, and in rare instances, unexpected forms of empowerment. These stories illuminate the complexity of the era's gender and class dynamics, revealing how individuals navigated oppressive systems with varying degrees of success and resilience. The next section continues by analyzing the societal fallout of the most severe Gilded Age marital collapses and the transformations they forced upon the economic landscape of the 20th century. The disintegration of these high-profile marriages forced American families to confront an uncomfortable truth. Wealth alone was insufficient to guarantee security within a system built upon unequal power dynamics. The fortunes accumulated through industry, speculation, and enterprise were vulnerable not only to market fluctuations but to the interpersonal dynamics of marriage, inheritance, and social expectation. As more scandals reached the public, families became increasingly conscious of how quickly generational wealth could evaporate through a single, poorly structured union. One consequence of this realization was the refinement of wealth management practices among America's elite. Prior to the scandals, many fortunes were held loosely, governed by informal family agreements and generational traditions rather than structured financial oversight. The fallout from catastrophic marriages prompted families to adopt more formalized strategies, including diversified trust portfolios, asset partitioning, and legal restrictions designed to ensure longevity across generations. Trust law underwent significant development during this period. Families began employing increasingly complex trust instruments that limited access to income, restricted liquidation of principal, and imposed conditions on inheritance distribution. These mechanisms aimed to prevent the sudden outflow of capital that had characterized earlier marriage-related losses. They also reflected a shift in ideology, a recognition that individual family members, even those with substantial wealth, required structural protections against external pressures. Simultaneously, legal advisors took on expanded roles, functioning not merely as estate managers but as guardians of family stability. They conducted background checks on potential suitors, assessed foreign legal frameworks, and negotiated prenuptial arrangements designed to withstand cross-jurisdictional challenges. Their involvement signaled a new era of professionalization in marital negotiations, transforming what had once been largely social decisions into matters of financial planning. These developments did not eliminate the risk inherent in marriage, but they significantly reduced the likelihood of catastrophic financial collapse. Wealthy families developed a heightened awareness of how marriage functioned within the broader economic ecosystem. They understood that personal unions could affect stock valuations, estate liquidity, and long-term philanthropic ambitions. The scandals, therefore, played a critical role in shaping the modern concept of financial stewardship. While structural reforms provided a measure of protection, the social consequences of the scandals continued to unfold. The collapse of high-profile marriages eroded the mystique surrounding aristocracy, fueling public skepticism toward claims of noble superiority. American confidence in the self-made industrialist grew as aristocratic titles lost their allure. The scandals inadvertently contributed to a cultural shift that favored meritocratic ideals over inherited status, a shift that aligned with the rising influence of progressive political movements. The decline of aristocratic prestige coincided with the emergence of new forms of American identity centered on innovation, philanthropy, and civic engagement. As wealthy families turned inward to protect their fortunes, they simultaneously expanded outward through public institutions, museums, universities, and charitable foundations. These endeavors provided alternate routes to legitimacy that did not require alliances with European nobility. In this sense, the scandals accelerated the process through which American wealth sought validation through societal contribution rather than foreign titles. At the same time, the scandals illuminated the emotional landscape of the Gilded Age in ways that had previously been obscured. The public became increasingly aware of the psychological strain placed upon heiresses navigating environments that offered immense privilege but limited personal autonomy. Testimonies from annulment trials, correspondence from disillusioned wives, and private diaries revealed the immense pressure faced by women whose marriages served as instruments of family strategy. This emotional dimension is often overshadowed by the financial drama surrounding the scandals, yet it remains central to understanding their full impact. Heiresses described isolation within foreign social circles, cultural dislocation, and expectations that demanded self-effacement in the face of public scrutiny. Many were forced to reconcile the contradiction between their personal desires and the obligations imposed upon them by family, society, and legal structures. Their struggles provided early insights into the gendered power imbalances embedded within elite marriage systems. The marriage scandals also contributed to the evolving discourse on women's mental and physical health. Physicians, social reformers, and journalists began to examine the toll that emotional stress, prolonged isolation, and marital coercion exerted on women. Cases like that of Mary Leiter highlighted the lethal consequences of political and social demands placed upon wives. Her death at 36 sparked commentary on the fragility of women's health under extreme societal expectations, prompting concerns about the intersection of gender, illness, and emotional burden. While public discussions often framed these issues within the language of female constitution, the underlying themes touched upon broader questions of autonomy, agency, and structural inequality. Women's organizations cited marriage scandals as evidence of the need for enhanced legal protections, including the right to retain personal income and property after marriage. Although significant reforms would not be enacted immediately, the scandals planted seeds for future changes in matrimonial law. The influence of these events extended into the political sphere as well. Some policymakers used high-profile divorces to advocate for uniform marriage and divorce laws across the United States. The inconsistencies between states, particularly the lenient policies of regions like South Dakota, which attracted women seeking relief from restrictive regulations, highlighted the need for reform. Public pressure mounted for standardized protections that would prevent exploitation and ensure fair treatment regardless of jurisdiction. The cultural ripple effects were equally notable. As the scandals unfolded, they reshaped popular narratives surrounding marriage, wealth, and identity. Plays, novels, and serialized newspaper stories portrayed heiresses as complex figures, navigating treacherous emotional and financial landscapes. These fictionalized accounts both reflected and reinforced shifting public attitudes. No longer did readers accept the notion that wealth guaranteed happiness. Instead, they recognized the precariousness underlying even the most seemingly privileged lives. Simultaneously, European aristocracy faced increasing scrutiny not only from Americans, but from within its own ranks. The influx of American wealth had initially provided a lifeline to struggling estates, but the scandals brought unwanted attention to the financial instability underlying many noble families. Some nobles objected to the commodification of marriage that the transatlantic market encouraged, arguing that it undermined traditional values. Others sought to distance themselves from families whose marriages had ended in public disgrace. The aristocracy, already under pressure from political reforms and economic challenges, now confronted a reputational crisis that further eroded its legitimacy. The long-term consequences for individual families varied widely. The Thaws, despite the spectacle of Alice's annulment and the unrelated scandal involving Harry Thaw, retained a measure of wealth and influence through strategic investments. The Zimmermans suffered reputational damage but benefited from Helena's eventual remarriage, which restored stability. The Goulds experienced both triumph and loss. While Anna regained autonomy through her second marriage, the depletion of her fortune altered the trajectory of future generations. The impact of Mary Leiter's death reverberated through the Curzon family, shaping political legacies and personal relationships in ways that persisted for decades. What unites these varied outcomes is the recognition that marriage, within the Gilded Age elite, functioned as a high-stakes mechanism of social and financial exchange. The fortunes at risk were not merely personal, but emblematic of broader shifts in wealth distribution and social stratification. The scandals exposed the extent to which traditional systems of power were ill-equipped to handle the complexities of rapidly accumulating American wealth. They demonstrated the fragility of inherited status when confronted with modern economic realities. As this documentary moves into its final analytical section, the focus shifts towards synthesizing the lessons derived from these scandals and examining their contributions to the transformation of marriage, wealth management, and social hierarchy in the 20th century. The concluding analysis explores how the failures of Gilded Age unions foreshadowed the decline of transatlantic aristocratic alliances and the rise of new models of partnership grounded in shared values rather than economic necessity. It also considers how these stories continue to shape cultural perceptions of wealth, vulnerability, and the institution of marriage itself. The historical significance of Gilded Age marriage scandals becomes clearer when examining how they reshaped the foundations of elite society in the decades that followed. These marriages, once heralded as triumphs of social strategy, ultimately revealed the instability of systems built upon unequal power structures and divergent cultural expectations. Their failures prompted not only personal reckonings but societal transformations that altered how future generations approached marriage, wealth, and identity. One of the most profound consequences was the gradual decline of the transatlantic marriage economy. Throughout the late 19th century, marriages between American heiresses and European nobles functioned as instruments of mutual benefit. American families gained access to titles and prestige, while European aristocrats acquired the financial resources necessary to sustain their estates. Yet, as scandal after scandal exposed the underlying fragility of these arrangements, both sides reassessed their assumptions. American families increasingly viewed aristocratic suitors with suspicion. The realization that foreign titles often concealed staggering debts undermined the belief that such unions guaranteed elevated social standing. Financial failures, public humiliation, and the emotional deterioration experienced by heiresses served as powerful deterrents. Many families began to prioritize stability, character, and compatibility over social ambition. By the early 20th century, the volume of transatlantic marriages had noticeably diminished, replaced by domestic alliances that aligned more closely with shared cultural values. European families, too, reassessed their relationship with American wealth. While many nobles still required financial assistance, the stigma associated with failed marriages and public scandals made some reluctant to engage in overt fortune hunting. The aristocracy faced increasing pressure to modernize estate management, diversify revenue sources, and reduce dependence on marital settlements. These shifts, though uneven, signaled a gradual transition away from the marriage economy as a primary means of preserving aristocratic fortunes. At the same time, the scandals contributed to the emergence of new ideals surrounding marriage itself. The concept of companionate marriage, which emphasized emotional compatibility, mutual respect, and shared interests, gained traction as a response to the failures of strategic unions. Although companionate marriage did not become widely accepted until later in the 20th century, the seeds were planted during the wake of these publicized failures. Commentators, reformers, and social observers began questioning the wisdom of entering marriages based on financial necessity or social aspiration rather than personal connection. These evolving attitudes intersected with broader developments in women's rights. As heiresses testified in court, petitioned for annulments, or pursued divorces, they demonstrated forms of agency that challenged traditional gender expectations. Their actions highlighted the need for legal reforms to protect women's property rights, expand grounds for divorce, and recognize emotional and psychological harm within marriage. Early feminist groups cited marriage scandals as evidence of systemic inequality, using them to advocate for expanded legal protections. Although significant legislative changes would take decades to achieve, the visibility of these cases contributed to a cultural shift. Women increasingly demanded access to independent income, legal counsel, and the right to maintain control over inherited assets. These demands laid critical groundwork for 20th century reforms that redefined marital property law and expanded legal recognition of women's rights. Culturally, the scandals also played a pivotal role in reshaping public narratives surrounding wealth. Prior to the scandals, wealth was often portrayed as a source of security, independence, and social opportunity. However, the stories of heiresses whose fortunes were drained by irresponsible husbands challenged this perception. Wealth alone proved insufficient to guarantee safety, particularly in a social environment where legal and cultural structures concentrated power in the hands of men. This realization influenced how wealthy families approached inheritance, philanthropy, and long-term planning. Many families shifted focus from conspicuous consumption to strategic investment and institutional legacy building. Philanthropic foundations, university endowments, and cultural institutions emerged as preferred vehicles for preserving wealth and shaping social identity. These endeavors provided tangible benefits to society while ensuring that fortunes could not be as easily siphoned away through personal relationships. The scandals even affected the trajectory of American fashion, architecture, and cultural aesthetics. The construction and eventual demolition of palatial residences, like the Palais Rose, symbolized the impermanence of luxury divorced from practicality. Architectural critics pointed to such structures as evidence of the dangers of excess. The decline of hyper-opulent domestic architecture in favor of more restrained styles reflected a shift in values influenced by the lessons of financial collapse. Simultaneously, popular media adopted the scandals as cautionary tales. Newspapers serialized divorce proceedings with dramatic flair. Magazines published exposes analyzing the hidden costs of aristocratic ambition. Literary works incorporated themes of disillusionment, financial betrayal, and the tension between appearance and reality, core elements of the scandals themselves. These representations contributed to a national dialogue about the nature of wealth and the consequences of pursuing status through marriage. In the broader context of American social development, the scandals marked a turning point in attitudes toward class mobility. The aspiration to elevate one's position through marriage into European nobility began to fade, replaced by a growing confidence in American identity. Industrial magnates, financiers, and entrepreneurs increasingly viewed their achievements as sufficient markers of status, independent of foreign validation. This shift aligned with a national ethos that valorized innovation, merit, and self-made success. The reverberations also influenced political perceptions. The spectacle of heiresses suffering at the hands of debt-ridden aristocrats undermined the romanticization of hereditary privilege. Progressive reformers leveraged these narratives to advocate for greater regulation, social welfare protections, and checks on economic inequality. They argued that the extreme concentration of wealth, while beneficial in generating opportunity, also exposed individuals and families to unique vulnerabilities. Marriage scandals became part of a broader critique of the Gilded Age's excesses, contributing to momentum for reforms that would shape the early 20th century. Despite their tragic dimensions, the scandals occasionally produced unexpected forms of empowerment. Some heiresses, after escaping disastrous marriages, rebuilt their lives with remarkable success. They invested in businesses, supported the arts, engaged in philanthropy, or remarried partners who valued mutual respect. Their resilience offered counter-narratives to the image of helplessness often associated with their class. These outcomes demonstrated that even within restrictive systems, individuals could carve pathways toward autonomy and fulfillment. Yet the emotional toll of the scandals remains a central component of their historical legacy. The stories reveal how deeply personal experiences intersected with global systems of wealth and power. They illuminate the human cost of social ambition, the fragility of security built on external validation, and the consequences of systems that denied women agency over their own lives. These themes continue to resonate in contemporary discussions surrounding wealth, marriage, and autonomy. As the documentary approaches its conclusion, attention turns towards synthesizing the lessons of these scandals and examining their long-term implications. The final analysis considers how the failures of Gilded Age unions signaled the transition from an era dominated by rigid hierarchies to one defined by modern conceptions of partnership, equity, and shared values. It explores how the scars left by these marriages informed shifts in legal structures, cultural attitudes, and the ongoing evolution of social norms that continue to shape the institution of marriage in the 21st century. The narrative now moves into its final section, analyzing how these scandals collectively reshaped understandings of love, power, and wealth, and what their enduring legacy reveals about the complex intersection of personal desire and socio-economic structure. The legacy of the Gilded Age love scandals lies not simply in the sensational headlines they produced, but in the profound structural and cultural transformations they triggered. These marriages, once celebrated as glamorous alliances bridging continents, ultimately revealed the precarious foundations upon which the era's notions of love, wealth, and power were built. Their unraveling forced families, policymakers, and society at large to confront the vulnerabilities embedded within systems that positioned marriage as a mechanism of economic exchange rather than a partnership grounded in mutual respect. One of the most enduring consequences of these scandals is the shift in how society evaluates the meaning and purpose of marriage. The Gilded Age had treated marriage as a transaction, a strategic instrument for consolidating influence, mapping social trajectories, and navigating the hierarchical currents of domestic and international elites. The failures of these unions exposed the inherent instability of this approach, prompting a reassessment of the psychological, emotional, and ethical dimensions of matrimonial relationships. As public awareness grew, the ideal of marriage as a mutually supportive partnership gained legitimacy. Observers noted that the marriages most likely to collapse were those formed on the basis of economic necessity, coercion, or social aspiration. Conversely, those that survived tended to reflect personal compatibility, aligned values, and emotional reciprocity. Over time, this distinction helped shift cultural emphasis from dynastic ambition toward individual fulfillment, a trend that would expand dramatically throughout the 20th century. The scandals also brought long-standing legal inequalities into sharper focus. Many of the heiresses who sought annulments or divorces found themselves constrained by outdated legal frameworks that favored male authority and prioritized the preservation of family reputation over individual autonomy. Their struggles illuminated the need for legislative reform and contributed to the national dialogue that would eventually transform marital law. Reforms in property rights, inheritance protection, and divorce procedures emerged not only from feminist advocacy but from the practical realities exposed by the failures of elite marriages. These legal transformations were incremental, often stymied by conservative resistance, yet they formed the basis for modern matrimonial law. The expansion of grounds for divorce, improved legal protections for women's property, and the increasing recognition of emotional distress as a legitimate factor in marital dissolution all trace intellectual roots back to the highly publicized struggles of Gilded Age heiresses. Even today, the emphasis on prenuptial agreements and asset protection strategies reflects lessons learned from the financial catastrophes that accompanied these unions. Beyond legal reforms, the social impact of the scandals shaped cultural identity in both America and Europe. In the United States, the decline of transatlantic marriage aspirations coincided with a growing national self-confidence. The collapse of these unions revealed the fragility of aristocratic prestige and underscored the limitations of inherited status. American elites increasingly embraced a vision of social prominence, grounded in innovation, philanthropy, and public service, rather than borrowed titles. This transition contributed to a uniquely American conception of elite identity, one that prized self-made success and measurable contributions over ancestral claims. In Europe, the scandals signaled the waning power of the aristocracy. As noble families lost access to American wealth, many were forced to adapt to new economic realities, diversify income streams, and reevaluate their relationship to traditional notions of privilege. The marriage economy that had once bolstered the aristocracy during periods of financial strain collapsed under the weight of public scrutiny and cultural change. The failures of these alliances accelerated the broader decline of hereditary power structures, particularly in the decades leading up to World War I. The psychological dimension of the scandals also warrants emphasis. The personal writings of heiresses, diaries, letters, and private accounts reveal an emotional terrain marked by loneliness, cultural dislocation, and the suffocating demands of public scrutiny. These narratives complicate romanticized depictions of Gilded Age wealth by exposing the mental and physical toll of maintaining appearances while enduring emotional neglect or exploitation. Their testimonies offer valuable insights into the lived experience of women whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, reminding us that vulnerability can exist even within extraordinary privilege. Despite their privileged circumstances, many heiresses confronted dilemmas that remain relevant today. The struggle to balance personal identity with external expectations, the challenge of asserting autonomy in relationships, and the emotional consequences of unequal power dynamics. Their experiences echo contemporary discussions surrounding financial inequality, gender roles, and the complexities of intimate partnership within a socio-economic framework. In this sense, the scandals serve as more than historical curiosities. They provide a lens through which modern society can examine the enduring intersections of wealth, power, and emotional labor. Furthermore, the scandals contributed to a transformation in media culture. Newspapers realized that marital collapse among the elite generated intense public interest, prompting an early form of tabloid journalism. Detailed coverage of divorce trials, settlement negotiations, and personal betrayals laid the foundation for the modern celebrity news cycle. The public's fascination with the intimate failures of the wealthy reflected not only curiosity, but a deeper skepticism toward claims of elite perfection. This skepticism, once aimed at the aristocracy, would later extend to industrialists, entertainers, and politicians. In time, the lessons of these scandals helped redefine the aspirations of elite families. Marriage ceased to be merely a strategic exchange and became, increasingly, a personal choice. While financial considerations still played a role, the expectation that emotional compatibility should accompany material security gained legitimacy. The model of modern partnership, with its emphasis on shared values, mutual support, and balanced power, owes much to the failures that preceded it. These societal shifts align with the broader democratization of social structures in the 20th century, where individual fulfillment began to take precedence over rigid hierarchies. The enduring fascination with the Gilded Age love scandals lies in their ability to capture the contradictions of the era. They expose the tension between opulence and vulnerability, power and fragility, public grandeur and private despair. They reveal how swiftly fortunes could shift, how precarious even the most illustrious marriages could be, and how deeply personal narratives intersected with broader social transformations. These stories remind us that beneath the gold-leafed surfaces of Gilded Age life existed complex human dramas shaped by ambition, desire, fear, and resilience. In the end, the scandals serve as cautionary tales, structural critiques, and cultural turning points. They illustrate that wealth alone cannot secure happiness, that status cannot substitute for integrity, and that systems built on inequality inevitably produce instability. Yet they also demonstrate the potential for renewal, how individuals, even in the face of profound personal loss, can reclaim autonomy, rebuild identity, and shape new legacies. The Gilded Age was an era defined by extremes, vast fortunes, glittering social aspirations, and unprecedented mobility. But its most revealing lessons emerge not from its triumphs but from its failures. The love scandals that ruined fortunes illuminate the complex human realities behind historical change, offering enduring insights into the interplay of emotion, power, and economic structure. Through these stories, we gain a clearer understanding of how personal relationships can reshape entire systems, and how the pursuit of status can both elevate and undo those who chase it. As we step back from the intricate narratives of heiresses, aristocrats, betrayal, and redemption, the overarching truth becomes unmistakable. The greatest transformations of the Gilded Age were not built in boardrooms, mansions, or legislative halls, but within the intimate, volatile, deeply human arena of marriage itself.